Today I'm going to be using Luminar AI to edit this photo of Tapu Bay here in New Zealand. There is a tree that is said to be the most photographed tree in the world here in New Zealand in Wanaka. Part of its allure is the isolation of this tree in the vastness of the surrounding environment. So when I was up high in a mountain bike park and I looked out to sea and I saw this isolated little tree on a rock, I knew that I had to get out there and get a photo of it. But the conditions for getting a great shot when I was there, they weren't photographically great. So my plan is to use the tools inside of Luminar AI to pull every bit of aesthetic goodness out of this photograph that I can. So grab yourself a nice drink and come along with me as I dive into Luminar AI and see what I can do with this photo. So first things first, let's jump into the Enhance AI tool and just see what our Accent AI slider does for us. And I quite like the effect in some areas, like around the actual tree and rock formation, but in the sky it's just over baking things just a little bit, and it's making those blues just a little bit too intense. So I'm going to use the mask feature. I'm going to bring my opacity down to about 45, and I'm just going to click, and I'm going to start painting this effect back in. Now I'm going to come in and select the gradient mask and just add a bit more gradient in here, so we get a bit of an effect of that up and through the sky. Okay, let's toggle this off and turn it on. Nice. Now what else am I going to do? I certainly want to come into the light section. I'm going to boost the exposure up slightly. Just keep my eye on the histogram. In fact, I like to drop the curves down so that I can see the histogram. Make sure I am protecting those highlights and perhaps even boost the shadows up. Just realize that I'm on the Luminar default profile. So I'm going to change that because I always like to be working in a camera neutral profile. Our white and black points are in a pretty good place, but I'm just going to make slight adjustments and see whether I prefer just pushing the whites up and bringing the blacks down. Now, one thing that's good to do when you are working with the white and black points is just to turn on the two triangles that you'll find in the left and right of the histogram. And if you don't see your histogram, just come over to view, and at the bottom here we have show histogram. And then by turning these little triangle markers on, what happens is when I push the blacks all the way down, we can now get a warning where the pure blacks are, and the same for the whites as well. So we're now able to adjust our white point until those red warnings go away. I'm not too worried about a slight warning over there. And the same for the blacks. We can start lifting those blacks back up until all the black warnings disappear. And now we know that we have a true black point in our image, which is there and in that deep little crevice there. Okay, let's see whether we benefit from any structure AI. So I'm just going to grab the amount slider and start bringing that up. I find the Structure AI tool pretty aggressive, and normally I'd put this nowhere near 100%. But what I'm going to do is leave this at 100% for this one, and I'm actually going to paint this in a little bit like I did with the Enhance AI tool. I'm just going to paint it around the key areas in the image that I want to pop. So I'm going to add a mask, grab my paintbrush tool, and again, with an opacity around that 25 mark again, I'm just going to click and roughly paint. I will certainly be coming back and doing some color work, but for now I'm just going to jump into the landscape section and just have a little play around here and see if we can't improve anything by using these sliders. Well, this dehaze slider is certainly oversaturating the blue, but one thing it is doing is actually bringing out a little bit of detail along the horizon line. You can see that the clouds and the sky itself is getting a little bit more color. If I take this away, everything gets a little washed out and bleached out on that horizon line, and as I bring this up, you just start to see a little bit more detail there. I'm now just going to cast my eye over other parts of the image as I roll this dehaze slider back and forth, and I'm just seeing if there's any other areas where I think that it's benefiting from this effect. And I've decided that I actually quite like the warmth that it's bringing into the highlight area on the rock itself. So again, I'm going to grab my mask tool here and I'm going to paint my mask in. I'm currently on the erase tool, so I'll make sure I'm on the brush. I'm going to use my right bracket key to expand the size of the brush, and I'm just going to make a sweep from left all the way to the right of the frame, and just like that we made that effect. And now I think we should have a little look at our before and our after on this image. We've got so much more pop and vibrancy going on in this image. So my thoughts at this point are, I like the interest and the detail that I've brought into the rock and the tree here. I feel that the sky is getting a little bit oversaturated. If you're a fan of bright colours, saturation, this might be right up your street and a really nice interpretation from that original raw file through to this. But for me, it's just a little bit overcooked. The other thing that I'm slightly concerned about is I feel like we've brought a lot of texture and detail into the photo, but we've done it in a global manner in such a way that it seems like everything's vying for your attention now. There's a lot of localized contrast, but it exists everywhere. So I'd actually like to soften off maybe the clouds in the sky and even the foreground here. I also want our viewer to focus very much on this tree here and this rock formation, but I want our eye to kind of glide up to this lonesome tree right here. And a great tool for guiding attention is just using the very fact that our eye goes to the brightest part of an image and falls away from darker parts of an image, so we can use a vignette. So I'm going to bring this amount slider down towards the left, because in this case we want to create a darkened vignette. For obviously we go to the right, we brighten things up, and I rarely take this slider towards the right, but if you wanted to create the look of a picture or almost like a painting that's just been painted onto a piece of white paper, for example, you could play around with these settings, increase the size or bring that in and choose the subject somewhere around the center point or focal point of your image and do something like that. But I like to darken down the corners. That's what I think this tool is more useful for. So we'll darken that off. And one other thing that I like to do just for a bit more believability for the vignette is to increase the feathering. So that's just softening the look. If I take it all the way to the left, you'll see that we get a pretty hard edge. Obviously that is very unbelievable. If we set it in the middle, we have a transition between the two, but if we push it all the way to the right, we get an even softer transition. So I always like to push the feathering pretty far to the right, often all the way to 100, so we get a really nice smooth transition from the brightest point to the darkest point. Let's have a little toggle of off, and in this original shot you can see that the sky pretty much has the same value going right the way across. Whereas when we turn the vignette on, this area is brighter, so our eye gets drawn more towards this area of interest. We might be able to further enhance this by actually brightening this inner area up. But because we've already set our exposure correctly, we don't want to be boosting this too far because obviously things are going to get overexposed. But we can add just a little bit just to help enhance and brighten this area. Okay, let's consider the light direction here. Based on the illumination of the rocks here, we can clearly see that we have the sun off camera to the right. But in the frame we have no visible light source whatsoever, and that's fine. But what I'm going to try to do using the sun rays tool is actually just see whether I can't create some sense of light, some sort of ethereal light rays coming from that right hand side. So let's give that a go. We're going to come to sun rays. We're going to put the amount up because until we have an amount we can't actually place the sun center or see anything going on, and we're going to grab it and we can actually pull the sun center off frame. And we can play with the positioning and bring it anywhere we like, really. We can crank the amount up even more, play with the overall look. And rather than having sun rays that are coming through in streaks, because that normally happens when the sun comes through and penetrates through the cloud, what I'm going to do is actually see if I can change the sun ray settings and reduce the number of rays. We've currently got 50. I'm going to bring this all the way down to 0. And this is really looking hideous right now, but I was pushing the amount quite high because I wanted to see exactly where my effect was. Let's see if we can't increase the warmth of the rays. So let's push this all the way to the right. Maybe not that far. I'm not sure if I like this or not. Let's toggle this off and put it back on. Do you know what? I'm going to leave it. I know a lot of you out there are thinking, oh no, I wouldn't do that. But guess what? It's my edit, so I'm going to leave it. Towards the end of the edit, I'll actually show you what I consider to be probably a better way to actually add the sense of a light source just being off screen. It's really useful, really powerful, but we'll get to that. I would love to have a look at the Atmosphere AI tool here and actually just see whether we can get a bit of fog coming across as if it's rolling across the landscape. So I like the layered fog. Let's crank the amount all the way to 100. And to get the most bang for your buck with this particular filter, what you need to do is play around with the depth. And then it will come forward from the horizon line, it will sneak its way into the front of the frame. I don't think that we necessarily need too much lightness from the fog. I just want a little bit of softening. Let me toggle this off. And I'm thinking that I just need to reduce that amount just slightly. I'm trying to make some changes here, but I'm trying to be subtle about it. If I flick back to our original and where we've got to, I'm liking the general direction, but I still feel we're slightly oversaturated, so I will be dealing with that, particularly in the blues. Oh, and by the way, if you don't have Luminar AI yet and you think it'd be a good fit for your photo editing, I've got a link in the description below and a discount code @Sky10, and you're welcome to use that and you can save some money at the checkout. The more I look at this photo, the more little areas like this little discrepancy here and this little area where the water level has just dropped low enough that we can see all of these little stones and rocks. It's just a visual distraction for me. It's like clutter in a room or something. It's just visually distracting. So I'm going to remove this. There's two ways I could attack this. I could either use the erase tool and just paint over this and let Luminar's AI figure out what it wants to do to remove those, or my approach is to actually take more control and use the clone tool. So because cloning is pixel based, when you click on this it takes you back to the original, so no problem there. Basically all we need to do is click on our source and then we're going to paint whatever we've sampled from over the top of something else. So I'm just going to paint over the top of that little rock that was there, and this large area that I want to get rid of here, I need to choose something that's a similar kind of tone. So I'm going to sample from here and give this a go. Yep, that's a pretty good match in terms of color tone. So we'll just go with that, paint some of that over here. I'm going to bring the opacity down quite low just so I can kind of paint in around the edges. We can just close the clone tool down, and now Luminar reapplies those edits that we've done so far. And I think it's time I need to address this blue. Like I said, you might like this bright blue, but for me it's just a little bit too oversaturated. Of course, we've got the option to desaturate the whole picture, but that isn't what I want to do here. I just want to start talking into those blues. So I'm going to bring the HSL, which stands for hue, saturation and luminance. And now I can talk directly into the blues. So if I come to the saturation of the blues, i.e. how intense it is, and I can just start to drop this back. Obviously I don't want to take it all the way, so we're just getting rid of all the blue. That's not what I want. But at the same time, I'm finding this is just a little bit too overpowering at its normal intensity. So I'm just going to bring that down. I don't know, -22 looks good. I'm also going to play with the luminance. So if I come here and grab the blue, we can push this slider to the right to brighten those blues up, or we can actually bring it to the left and we can darken those blues down. And as I do that, it's quite nice because it's adding contrast between the clouds and the blue in the sky. And if you use polarizing filters, you'll know that this is the kind of effect that you get by doing that anyway. So it's quite nice that we have the ability to add that effect in post-production. And now I've dropped the luminance. I think I might just bring just a little bit of that saturation back in. And I've also made the decision that what I was trying to achieve with the sun rays coming through here, I really don't like it. It's not really achieving the result I was after. So just like that, gone burger. Okay, I want to keep the texture that we've got going on here, but I was saying before, I just want to soften some of the areas above and below off slightly. And I think what I'll do is try a couple of the glow filters just to see if I can achieve that. I'm going to put the amount somewhere around there so I can see what it's doing, and I'm just going to flick between these glows just to see what I like. As I toggle that off and toggle it on, the standard glow is quite nice. The Autumn effect is okay, but it's overexposing just slightly. And the soft version of the Autumn effect, it's certainly brightening things up. So what I might do actually is just ease this in ever so slightly. Look at my before and my after. So that's softening things just a little bit. I quite like that. And I'll use the mystical filter as well. Now I'm going to push this quite high, let Luminar do its calculations. And now I can play around with these settings with the amount at 100% so I can see exactly what these changes that I'm doing and making to the photo. Luminar's not being quite as responsive as it normally is for me at the moment. As I'm recording this, I'm also exporting another video. I've got Lightroom catalog open and Photoshop running in the background as well. So I probably should have closed those down before I started. Okay, once I'm happy with the overall look of the mystical filter, that's when I drop it back to 0. And then start just easing it back in and seeing what it looks like. I don't like the warmth that I was adding, it's just changing the colour tonality too much. Now, one of the things I like about the masks is that we're not confined to an all or nothing approach. We have that ability to actually paint any effect in exactly where we want it. And we can do that with varying amounts. So if I grab my mask again, this time what I'm going to do is say I want it everywhere, but I'm going to start to erase it from areas I don't want it. You can see around the tree here, we're just starting to get a little bit of haloing going on, and I don't really like that. So with 50% here, I'm happy with that. I'm just going to click and start erasing this effect from the area I don't want it. So now we have a lot of softening going on in the clouds and a lot in the foreground, but only 50% of this effect we created over our main feature here. I'm going to reduce the opacity again just a little further, use my right bracket key to expand the brush size, and I'm going to click and drag. Now normally I'd be doing this, painting this in with my graphics tablet, but I'm actually doing this all with a mouse today, old school style. So now if I toggle this off, we can see that all of a sudden everything just pops back in with a little bit more clarity. And if I turn it back on again, things are nicely softened up in the top half of the image in the clouds, and here in the foreground where we had a lot of little bitty details going on, which I find a little bit distracting. Because I've got the overall look of my photo kind of where I want it to in a global sense, it now frees me up just to be a little bit more specific about my artistic decisions. And one of the things I'd like to do is what I call sculpting the light. And I do that using the local masking features, and that will enable me to actually paint brighter and darker parts into the photo. So what I'm thinking of doing is actually creating a brighter patch, maybe a radial filter, a bit of a glow to the right hand side here, which is going to hopefully emulate the fact that we have light coming from the right hand side, just with a nice soft bit of warm light coming from that right hand side. And the other thing I'm going to experiment with is just darkening down some of the other areas, again to help draw our attention to this main feature right in the middle here. When I'm done with that, I'm going to enhance the details and the sharpening in the main features of our photo, and my favorite bit, which is actually enhance the mood with some colors. So first things first, let's just jump into the local masking, add a new basic mask, and let's create this kind of light effect from the right hand side. So I'm going to play with these sliders here and just see if I can't create the sense of sunlight coming from this right hand side. So I'm going to overcook things. I'm going to overexpose them. That's fine. I just want to create the general sense of light. I'm going to reduce the structure because sometimes when we have a soft light coming in, things get just a little bit soft and dreamy. So I'll bring that structure AI down. Drop the saturation just a little bit. We've boosted the warmth up towards those orangey yellow tones, hopefully just to emulate sunlight. And now I'm going to try and create a mask, a radial mask, nice and large, where this is just going to feather in. So I'm going to click just to the right of the frame here, and let's bring this effect nice and large. And there we go. We have the opposite of what we're after, but that's fine. All we need to do is switch the mask up. So by clicking this icon here, we invert what we just had before. So you can just toggle between the effect you've created being inside the radius of this circle or falling on the perimeter. So we want it to appear just here. So I'll click that icon, and now I'm grabbing that point and just making this just a little more elliptical. And I think I'm happy with the general position here. I've made this really large so that we have the same kind of principle of that large feathering fall off going on. And now I'm just going to ease my settings back just to a point where I feel like it's just a little bit more believable. Okay, I'm now going to paint the mask and just erase this effect from places I don't really want it. I don't want the opacity too high because I want the transition to be soft. So here's our picture without that light flare. And then if I turn that on, it just gives this sort of hint of light bleeding in from that right hand side. Off and on. I'm just going to remove it just a little more from some of these areas where I feel like it's just getting a little bit too much. Okay, now I'm going to do the opposite effect. I'm going to create a darkening local mask and paint that in some of the areas. So we're going to go to add basic. And rather than just darken down the overall exposure, I'm going to play with some of these other sliders as well, just to do some things like reduce the overall contrast. Okay, I'm going to grab my paintbrush and I'm just going to actually manually paint this in, keep my opacity low, quarter of the amount. When you paint these masks in, sometimes it can just be a bit of a dance back and forth, finessing things until you feel like you've got it right. And now let me toggle this off. And prior to applying this, I feel like the white clouds were just a little bright and just leading our eye off and away and out of the frame. We've just dulled those down, reduced the contrast and brought the highlights down again, just to help our viewer's eye stay within the frame and stay in the key area I want them to look, which is this beautiful rock formation and this lonely little tree. Okay, let's play with the colors. So I'm going to jump back into the editing section. And I'm going to jump into the mood section because this is by far the quickest way just to give your photo an overall change of feeling. And as I scroll over these, I already like the kind of looks that this effect is giving me. Some of them give that nice blue-orange pop. Some of them just reduce the contrast slightly like 1960. We have a lot of options here with these LUTs. I actually want to go for a kind of painterly look. Okay, after having a look through these and thinking that there are some very viable contenders here, I've actually decided to go with this one, Genius. That sounds like a clever thing to do. So we'll apply Genius. I've got it at 30%. If I turn it off and then I turn it back on again, you can see that it's very subtle. And if I crank it all the way to 100, you can actually see exactly what this process is doing. It's very soft, it's very subtle. I quite like it. Normally I'm happy with 30% for this amount slider, but I'm going to push this one just a little further. One of the really nice things with Luminar is you have many color tools which you can compound and add one on top of the other. So as well as the mood tool here, which I really, really love, we could also, for instance, come into the toning tool and we can work with the color of the shadows and the highlights specifically. So we have already applied a bit of a color to the shadows and the highlights with that mood tool. But if I want to get more precise and, you know, layer another color on top, what I can do is increase the saturation for the highlights and now come in and grab the hue slider and actually just change the color. And I quite like that satin blue, actually. That's quite nice. But let's see if we can't enhance the oranges slightly more. Let's not push things too far. We'll keep the amount slightly down and now jump into the shadows and we can do the same again. We can push the saturation up so that we can see what we're doing, and then we can come into the hue slider. And I'm choosing to do a complementary color scheme. So the blues in the shadows, the oranges in the highlights, and the amount that I've got it set to at the moment is too much, but we'll just taper that down to 13. And let's have a little look at our before and our after. That's nice and subtle. Okay, we're closing in on the finish. One thing I would like to do is make sure that this area through here, and particularly the tree, are nice and sharp. And so what I'm going to do is come in and use the sharpening tool here. So before I start cranking this up, a good idea is to make sure that we're set to 100% resolution. Come into an area of detail, which we've got here. A little bit of tree, a little bit of rock, and we can already see that we're pretty sharp straight out of the camera actually. But if we grab the sharpening amount, we can see that that certainly helps the details in the rocks, but we are starting to get a little bit of haloing going on, so I don't want to take that too far. We can actually enhance the large, medium and small details as well, and because this is quite a nice interesting rock formation here, it might be quite nice just to bring these sliders up slightly. Okay, that's probably a little bit too much, so I'll just bring these back down, and now what I'm going to do is actually add another mask. I'm going to zoom out so I can see all of my picture. And rather than apply this sharpening effect all over the photo, because I don't want to be sharpening details in the clouds, I want to keep those nice and soft and fluffy, but I do want to add detail around here. So I'm going to grab my brush again and I'm going to paint the mask in, and this time I'm going to start around 50% just so we can get this done quite quickly, and make the brush slightly smaller using the left bracket key, and now we're just going to paint quite loosely over this area here. And this time not bleed over into the sky at all, but just keep it very localized over the rocks. Press the left bracket key just to shrink the brush again and just paint that tree a little more accurately. And now we know that we have a lovely sharp tree and rock formation, whereas everything else in the background remains unsharpened. And that's what I want. You may have noticed throughout my editing, I've utilized tools and masking to try and bring the viewer's attention to the area where I want them to look. As my very final thing, I'm just going to jump into the light section again here, and I'm going to come down to the curves, and I'm just going to have a little tinker with the curves and see if I can't improve the contrast of the picture. And that, my friends, is where I think I'm going to leave this edit. I do like this original capture, but part of the enjoyment for me is pushing the creativity of what I've captured in camera and putting a little more artistry into the actual finished piece. So let's look at the finished edit from Luminar. I've tried to use the various tools at my disposal inside of Luminar to craft a more finessed image where I'm guiding my viewer's eye and saying, look at the tree, look at the rock, this is important. And then other supporting elements such as the clouds and the foreground reflection. I'm just trying to let that stop competing with the viewer's attention and just recede slightly in the image. So again, here's our before. Here's our after. I've tried to create a nice harmonized color palette and a more painterly look to this photo. So whether or not I've achieved that, I'm not entirely sure, but I quite like the finished result. Let me know what you thought. It's been a while since I've edited a landscape photo, so I really enjoyed that editing session. If you enjoyed it too, do me a favor, give me a thumbs up. I've got the best audience on YouTube, so I value your opinion, guys. Let me know what you thought of the photo. Let me know what your favorite tool was or editing technique. Did you learn something? Let me know in the comments. If you are still watching, guys, a massive thank you for staying with me through the whole video. Really means the world to me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.